World War II, alternate history golden goose, or dead horse I can't stop beating? You decide. As much as the war has become a cliche at this point, I mean, hey, it makes sense. Just this 6-year span of time, foreign freedom units were so packed with events that had one gone differently, it would have changed a lot. Even if Germany still loses the war, the world after that defeat was not predetermined. It was shaped by closed-door meetings, shifting priorities, inner power struggles, and even failed assassinations. Speaking of which, Operation Zeppelin, a failed German operation in late 1944, where a Soviet deserter flew from Riga in an attempt to assassinate Joseph Stalin. Oh, you thought I was talking about the other assassination. Oh no, that's a different video. We're taking out Stalin today. You might be thinking, how the hell does that even relate to this weird video title? Well, I want to imagine a reality where Stalin gets shot in November 1944, which sets off a chain of events that, in this alternate scenario, lead to the downfall of the Soviet Union by 1950. No, it's not Operation Downfall. This video was sponsored by Ground News. Stalin's regime was one of fear and censorship. But it doesn't just take censorship to stop the spread of information. Bias in the media is something that happens every day, even if you don't think about it. That's where Ground News, the sponsor of today's video, comes in. Crosswalk buttons hacked to play hoax Musk Zuckerberg recordings. Well, okay then. Let's see who's reporting on this. It's a lot of centrist outlets. Ground News is a service that gives you a full panoramic view of any topic. Thanks to ratings from 3 independent organizations, you can see on a scale what article has which bias, who's talking about this topic, who isn't. You can see how many outlets are even reporting on it. What's funny about this crosswalk thing is that since the topic is so, normal, very few partisan outlets even care to report on it. That's kind of funny. You can even compare headlines to see how a story is being spun, and then click to see the original source. Perhaps there's stories that one side just isn't reporting. Well, now you can see them thanks to the blind spot feed. So if you want to shift through the confusion and tackle even the mildest of censorship, go to groundnews.com/alternate to save 40% for unlimited access on the Vantage plan with this link for this month only. So why not stay fully informed and have a data-driven way to read the news? Special thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Alright, back to Stalin. The year is 1944. The roaring engines of American industry were ignited, Lend-Lease would reach its peak, and the Axis were in retreat after Stalingrad and Kursk. But they weren't down for the count. The Allies had taken Sicily and southern Italy, but were struggling to make progress. Plans were underway for the invasion of Normandy and the Philippines. By 1944, the Big Three began to split apart, as each leader had a different vision on what this post-war world might look like. Roosevelt was focused on founding the United Nations, favored a new order of republics. Notably, he wanted to build up China as a new great power. Congress backed his plans, but he understood that he couldn't drag his feet forever. This war needed to be put to a swift end. Churchill strived to preserve the British Empire and fend off communism, believing in the tradition of monarchy. Because of that, he was actually against the D-Day landings, instead hoping to attack Yugoslavia, march on Vienna, and cut off the Soviets. As for Stalin, he felt like the blood spilt by his people gave him a right to the biggest chunk of the pie. He would use the counterattack to spread the Soviet ideology as far as he could. Armies were mobilized, plans were made, and at Tehran, Churchill was outvoted. D-Day was going to happen, coinciding with a major push from the Soviets, and all sides agreeing that they'd accept nothing but an unconditional surrender. Roosevelt and Stalin reluctantly sacrificed eastern Poland, compensating it with lands taken from Germany, in return for the Soviet pledge to attack Japan 3 months after Germany was dealt with. Roosevelt got a slight nod from the other two for his UN project, and then they all got to work. Spoilers, but D-Day was kind of a success. By September, all of France was liberated, and the Soviet army penetrated the Balkans. Finland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Greece folded almost instantaneously. with tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers left on their own. The fate of Europe was to be decided in just a few weeks, and Stalin decided he was no longer with the Big Three. It was now just the Big Me. An urgent meeting was called, this time in Moscow. But due to his re-election campaign, Roosevelt couldn't attend. He really needed to get that fourth term. October 1944. Churchill flew over to the Soviet capital in a desperate attempt to safeguard British shipping. His goal? Prevent the Russian bear from gripping Greece and establishing zones of influence. But here, we see Stalin at his best. Stalin's stoic, smart. He plays Churchill like a fiddle. Old Joseph rubs salt into the wound, as he pointed out that Roosevelt agreed to the outrageous idea of forcing the British to give Hong Kong back to the Chinese, half of which was in Japanese hands. He outlined the hypocrisy of America controlling the Panama Strait, Britain owning the Suez, while the Soviets were blocked off from the Bosphorus. Tisk tisk. A small note was passed around between the two leaders like they were schoolgirls or something, and that schoolgirl note changed history forever. Rather than being called the Moscow Conference of 1944, or being referenced by its codename Tolstoy, this meeting is now remembered as the Percentages Agreement. That's really the name they went with, huh? See, I prefer the nickname coined by Churchill, the Naughty Document. This small sheet of paper, which survives to this day, outlined zones of influence in which the British and the Soviets divide Eastern Europe between themselves. Uncle Sam was not in the room, and in just one meeting, Stalin had Churchill legitimize the Soviet violent takeover of Romania and Bulgaria, planting the seed for the future. The Prime Minister was so glad to secure a Soviet-free Greece. He even managed to get Stalin to reluctantly agree to a French occupation zone in Germany. This was aimed to restore French confidence. Give him just something to go on for. America had a representative present who relayed some of this stuff back to the president, but the fact that even this representative didn't know about the percentage split tells you all you need to know. Keep in mind that Churchill's own doctor, Lord Moran, had this to say in his diary just 40 days before the meeting. Problem is that he was also petrified of America going back to isolationism. Churchill knew that he was making a deal with the devil. And the worst part is that after getting everything he wanted, Stalin still broke the deal. Okay, so apart from being kind of interesting, what's the point of any of that? Well, you see, this is very important, because in this alternate timeline, we're gonna have Stalin die a month after this meeting. Time to throw everything into chaos. After Barbarossa, the Germans captured many Soviet POWs. With this, they developed a special operation, one where they handpicked some of these men to act as secret agents. In its first year alone, 3,000 agents graduated from the program. Some were saboteurs, others military experts who prepared maps and charts of Soviet regions. At one point, the Axis had between 500 and 800 agents behind enemy lines. Enter Agent Officer Shiloh. Captured in May 1942, he quickly rose through the program, going from a one-use agent to a valuable asset. He passed all the tests, bragged about his medals and connections in Moscow. After witnessing the failures of the Wehrmacht, Mustache Man turned to more unconventional means for victory. V-2 missiles, super weapons, and espionage. The plan was for this deserter to assume the identity of Major Peter Tavrin. For the disguise, he'd get a spare set of documents of an officer who arrived from the hospital for treatment. In order to confirm the story, he underwent several plastic surgeries to imitate traces of severe wounds on his body. The saboteur's chest was decorated with orders, medals, and even a genuine star of the hero of the Soviet Union, taken from killed officers. Newspapers with decrees on awards were put into a field bag, where, among others, the name Tavrin was mentioned. For his weapon, Peter was equipped with 2 hidden pistols with explosive and poisonous bullets, alongside an incendiary device inside a briefcase, controlled by radio. He even had a miniature grenade attached to his arm, in case the gun and briefcase somehow failed. To conceal all of this, he was given a special leather coat with an extended right sleeve. The target? Joseph Stalin himself, present for the annual October Revolution Parade, celebrated the 7th of every November, Julian calendar. On the night of September 3rd, a lone transport plane carrying Peter and his wife flew off from Riga. Things went sideways immediately. The plane was shot at by anti-aircraft guns near Smolensk. Somehow, the damaged aircraft was able to make an emergency landing, and the pair escaped the wreckage by motorcycle. They would have to travel to Moscow by bike, until they were apprehended by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. The thing is, even after all the preparation, Peter wore that shiny metal on his left shoulder instead of his right. Big mistake. But also carrying special Bond-level equipment? Ooh, that's a one-way ticket to the gulag, buddy. So what if they just hadn't been shot down? Or been caught? They would have had a chance, right? No. Turns out the game was rigged from the start. Thanks to Allied counterintelligence, the Soviets knew about every step of this plan for an entire year. They knew about the coat, the plane from Riga, and they just played along the entire time, letting the spy continue to send telegrams to the Führer. Even a month before Berlin fell, the Russians were still gaslighting the Germans, making their agents think they still had a chance. This was basically a big prank by the Soviets aimed to waste Axis time. And when the plan was finally carried out, they shot the plane down and sent like 150 agents to arrest the spy. The Germans never had a chance. All that planning, and it went to waste. So let's fix that. November 1944. Joseph Stalin is shot dead in the middle of Red Square. Special Agent Peter might have been the one who pulled the trigger, but the man behind it all was a Soviet. The only way Peter got that far was thanks to Lavrenti Beria. Beria was the head of the NKVD secret police. And in this alternate timeline, rather than stopping the infiltrators, he has another idea. Through intentional inaction, he guides the assassin to their target. Beria gets Stalin out of the way. Now, Beria was way worse than Stalin. Like, this guy is easily one of the most evil monsters who ever lived. This Soviet version of Himmler was the instrument Stalin used to conduct the Great Purge. Gulags, executions, famine, stamping out dissent by wiping out entire villages, there was nothing Beria wouldn't do. But it went even farther than that. Went into stuff that wasn't even politics. His crimes were so degenerate and evil, I cannot say them on YouTube. Maybe I'll just list them off in the Patreon version of this video or something. So, go see that version if you want to hear some stuff that will absolutely ruin your day. To get somewhat of an idea though, let's say that there was a discovery made in a Moscow basement containing piles of bones, including children. Before he was taken out and put down like a dog, Hannibal Lecter had stacked the secret police with loyal supporters. Beria had become so powerful that even Uncle Joseph flirted with the idea of taking him out. In fact, when the Man of Steel did die 10 years later in our timeline, Beria made a bid for power, and that really didn't work out. In this alternate 1944, while he's still hated by virtually everyone else in power, instead of being reactive when Stalin dies, he's proactive. Let's say that after catching Peter and his wife in September, Beria is given 2 full months to prepare his violent takeover. A takeover at the perfect possible time. Thanks to a decentralized military command, the war could still carry on. But most importantly, the bulk of the generals who absolutely hated Beria and the NKVD would be far from reach. Stalin did everything he could to prevent a natural succession, as he thought he was invincible even later into his life. There were still a few clear options though, with Beria being in the top 3 since he was one of the most fanatical Stalinists. He even wrote a book about the guy. One thing Beria loved more than Stalin though, was power. And also something else, but we're not going to talk about that. Betrayal isn't entirely out of Beria's character. Let's assume Khrushchev, Molotov, and Malenkov are all rounded up and never seen again. RIP. The only other threat to Beria's extension was Marshal Zhukov, but since he was fighting in Poland, he wasn't an immediate threat. The state apparatus would grind to a halt as a new purge was underway, but this doesn't change much on the battlefield. Taking out Stalin would have far more repercussions if done in the dire phases of the war. But by 1944, the Red Army was on autopilot towards Berlin. Another thing to consider is just how slowly news traveled, especially when impeded by the NKVD. So by the end of 1944, Beria is firmly in charge. But how does that lead to the title of the video? By 1954, Stalin had overstayed his welcome. His peacetime policies were not the best. Mixed in with his paranoia, the Soviet political climate had everyone ready to take down the cult of personality he had built. If he gets shot in the middle of World War II instead, he dies a martyr. A hero who saved the Soviet people from the brink of destruction and was killed by a traitor sponsored by fascists. For the Germans, Stalin's death is a massive morale boost. Fighting in the East and West intensifies. Operation Market Garden, which was already an arguable disaster, is followed up by even more fanatical counterattacks. As for the Allies, the man who Roosevelt and Churchill referred to as Uncle Joseph was a key ally. The unpredictability brought in by this new Beria would be a catastrophe. Eastern Europe had just fallen, and after the liberation of France, Eisenhower was appalled at the logistical situation, even calling for the stop of all bombing raids against the railways. In our timeline, the Allies saw no point in rushing for Berlin. In their mind, the German partition meant that the East would go to the Soviets, so there would be no strategic merit for advancing ahead of schedule. Yet now, with Stalin dead, the agreement for both Eastern Europe and Germany's fate is just up in the air. Nobody has a clue if the new leadership would actually honor Stalin's word. A few months later, they'd meet the new leader, and hopefully come to an understanding at the Yalta Conference. February 1945. The long 7,000-mile trip followed by the trek to Yalta saps Roosevelt of his last remaining strength. Witnesses reported that the 75-year-old president stared at nothing, with his mouth open for prolonged periods. FDR was in bad shape. He passed away 2 months later. Beria was privy to all of Stalin's ideas, and he had a lot to prove. His most important and very militaristic adversary, Zhukov, would never allow him to even pretend to make the compromises Stalin gave. What could this dying president and prime minister of a depleted empire truly do to stop the Soviets? Beria could refuse their demands, or at the very least, make some new ones of his own. Okay, so let's review the promises Stalin made, kept, and cards he kept off the table in 1945. Stalin agreed to help against the Japanese in return for influence and some islands. He agreed to help Roosevelt form the United Nations if the Soviet republics of Belarus and Ukraine were given a separate vote. Lastly, he reluctantly accepted France's occupation zone, but never viewed them as an actual power due to them being France in World War II. Now, for the most important one, a free European buffer zone. Austria was to be divided like Germany. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, and Bulgaria were to hold elections without foreign interference and be free. Here, it was Churchill who made significant concessions to the Americans who were against his whole imperialistic notions of monarchy. Churchill even dreamt of creating 3 new unions, those of Yugoslavia with Greece, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, and even bringing back the good old Austro-Hungarians. Wow, none of this was happening, and Stalin stalled at the negotiation table. All while his army was setting up the Warsaw Pact. As for the cards Stalin kept off the table, but were heavily discussed within his inner circle, we have a battered but unified and democratic Germany, think post-World War I, weird, I know, Soviet control of the Bosphorus, which sparked the first crisis of the Cold War in 1946, full Soviet control of Berlin, later leading to the Berlin airlift, keeping Soviet troops in northern Iran, which led to the 46 Iran crisis, and last, a deep desire to punish the Italians for siding with Germany, despite the Allied sentiment to let bygones be bygones. Now ask yourself, would Beria, who wanted to seem strong in the face of Western imperialism, stall like Stalin did? After all, in early 1945, the Manhattan Project wasn't unveiled yet. The Soviet Army's ego was as large as its manpower pool, and unlike the Americans who already wanted to go home and start baby booming, Soviet soldiers were better off looting in the now warm front lines. Most importantly, Roosevelt craved Soviet interference against Japan, as much as Churchill craved American aid against Germany. Beria would understand that if he planted his foot down, there was nothing the Americans or British could do to stop him. So what does Roosevelt do? Honestly, I'm not 100% sure. This is an impasse, and uncomfortable situation we never really had in our time. So, let's just say the scenario is a toss-up. 50-50, since the pressure for both ideas is pretty massive. Perhaps FDR accepts several of the Soviet demands like the Strait in Iran, while alienating his cabinet and allies. Or perhaps Churchill tells Beria to piss off, and we have a whole Operation Downfall. For the sake of the scenario, let's say FDR goes with the former, capitulating to some Soviet demands, enraging pretty much everyone around him in an effort to save American lives. Keep in mind, this is the exact reason why the Secretary of State Cordell Hull resigned in '44. He and many others hated that Roosevelt personally handled major negotiations instead of relying on the State Department. Others hated him for his over-reliance on the Soviets, the Mediterranean distraction, and Europe First strategy that left the Pacific theater with less resources. France, Italy, Turkey, and all of Eastern Europe would be thrown under the bus as the two sides make their final march on Berlin. This move secures Beria's leadership, and the support of the generals, who he needed to keep in line after spending so much of his time persecuting them in the past. Churchill, Eisenhower, McCarthy, and many others would be so enraged. One Trinity test and a new President Truman later, nothing about the war really changes, except for one significant divergence. In our timeline, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were a major wake-up call for Stalin. The Soviets had a nuclear program of their own, but it was poorly run by bureaucrats. Once he saw the bombs in action, Stalin appointed Beria himself as chief architect of the program. Beria lacked Oppenheimer's talent for uniting people, and wasn't a logistical mastermind like General Groves. He did, however, have a spy network, one that orchestrated one of the greatest acts of industrial espionage in history. Within just 4 years, the Soviets copied the Americans' homework, caught up, and got an atomic bomb of their own. This is the major divergence of the entire scenario. This is why the video title is the way it is. As you see, Beria being in charge of the Soviet Union isn't the major factor here. It's Beria not being in charge of this specific spy operation, because his priorities would have shifted in this alternate timeline. He couldn't steer the Soviet Union in the midst of its most turbulent period while also conducting this massive heist. That's like asking General Groves to run Manhattan while invading Japan. I'm not saying that in the scenario the Soviets would have never gotten a bomb, because they certainly would have. They had German scientists and a ton of resources. I'm simply suggesting that something here would have changed. Something would have gotten delayed in the spy game. Perhaps instead of 4 years to get the bomb, it takes the Soviets 6, or even 10. In the post-World War II landscape, this would be huge. When it comes to history, timing is everything. In this alternate timeline, when FDR's pact with Beria is made, it's seen as an embarrassing stain, but also a necessity to avoid another war and the death of over 500,000 Americans. Yet by 1946, just like in our time, America is now in possession of the most powerful weapon on the planet, paired with the strongest air force, all while Beria's true face is slowly revealed. Churchill is still ousted from government in the 1945 general elections, and the British are still firmly with Truman in his anti-Soviet stance. In our 1946, America sent a warship to protect Turkey's Bosphorus Strait, and armed Iran against the Soviet forces who refused to withdraw. In 48, Truman organized the Berlin airlift, and then 2 years later took swift action in the Korean War. Similar events, sure, but the conditions are different. The military now is even more disgruntled by the end of the war. Truman and Beria would clash, and Beria is the key to all of this. How does an overconfident Beria act on the world stage when given the power of Stalin? Would he even know when to back down from these situations like Stalin did? Or would he perhaps go further out of fear that he could be seen as weak by his internal enemies? Beria wouldn't be the hero of the Soviets like Stalin had been, nor would he be in that safe of a position. He's really a bit of a wild card here, and he's certainly not the best in charge of the Soviet state during a time when cooler heads really should prevail. Perhaps in this alternate timeline, things go a bit too far. One of these crises spiral out of control, leading to the war that everyone expected to happen to actually happen. But in this alternate world, the Soviets would not be a nuclear power. The US would be uncontested in that regard. When asking the question, what if the Allies beat the Soviets by 1950, we're talking about a post-war world that is far messier than our own time. Beria on the world stage is no Stalin. He's trusted by nobody at home or abroad, and that's dangerous. So really, the crux of the video is what if somehow relations deteriorated to such a level that the West and Soviets went to war within the 1940s. First, the whole Beria takeover means that the Soviet leadership takes a massive hit. Restructuring the entire government apparatus is hard enough in peacetime. To do it in the midst of a war with extended supply lines is just crazy. This isn't that big of a deal during the war while the Germans were collapsing, but it is a big deal in a new war against the West. A lot of key bureaucrats and generals would have been sent off to the Gulag during and especially after Germany's capitulation. You can have as much manpower as you want. If you don't have capable generals to lead them, you're just throwing bodies in a ditch. Next, we have logistics. When people imagine Operation Unthinkable, they imagine the Allies fighting the Soviets. But so much of that Soviet army was already on the American payroll. They were provided with 300,000 jeeps and trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles, including 7,000 tanks, 11,400 aircraft, and 1.75 million tons of food. The Soviet war machine ran on American oil, American food, with soldiers driven to the front line on American tanks and trucks. Now that I think about it, it would be pretty fitting for the US to fight a war with people they literally just supplied. Now, would this be that dramatic of a factor in the war? Maybe. Soviets would have supply issues. Yeah, but I don't know if the Allied public would tolerate such losses in a profound conflict right after World War II. Speaking of losses, the Soviets had a lot. If you had the bad luck of being born a man in the Soviet Union in the 1910s, the likelihood of you celebrating your 21st birthday was just 20%. In our time, they were able to at least rest and replenish a little bit, but needing to fight almost immediately and still hold Europe might be asking too much of the Red Army. They would be fighting not only the Allies, but Poles, Germans, Czechs, Serbs, and many others, all of which the Americans would be arming. That said though, on the ground, I think this would be an even fight. Even with the disadvantages the Soviets had, they would make some progress. But there's one place the Soviets wouldn't be able to fight, and that's the air. Look, there's really no reason to talk about alternate tactics and strategy in this war, because holy hell is there an air force imbalance between these two. Like I mentioned in that Dunkirk video, America funded the creation of a bomber fleet 3 times as expensive as the Manhattan Project. It cost 3 times more to make a plane fly higher than it was to split the atom. The US specialized in building high-altitude, long-range bombers, which are extremely difficult to make. The ultimate payoff being that you could fly over anywhere without an escort and just drop the bombs. All this talk of logistics and manpower really mean nothing when the B-50 Superfortress exists. In 1947, there was nothing, and I do mean nothing, stopping the B-50 Superfortress from firebombing or even nuking Moscow. This thing flew so high, no technology was capable of hitting it. That high altitude made any radar, anti-air guns, and even fighter planes absolutely useless. There was nothing so untouchable in human history as this dumb plane. Even today, we have the ability to shoot things down with missiles. They didn't. In this hypothetical war, for a brief amount of time, if the US wanted to nuke the Soviets from the sky, they just could. The Allies knew where all the industrial centers were and would be able to take most of them out. Bye-bye, Siberian Railroad. So long, Caucasus oil fields. Unless the Soviets traveled into the future and brought back a couple of MiG-15s from 1949, they're ruined. In just 1947, Congo uranium and the American industry could make a nuclear arsenal ranging between a few dozen to 100 nukes. Even without the delay in the Soviet nuclear program, which would certainly be there, what exactly is the Soviet response here? On the ground, they're still a capable force, but everywhere else, they have nothing. Within a month, the Allies have complete aerial and naval dominance. And this isn't pretty. Think of this in human terms. I'm talking about a couple of months where the horrors of Nagasaki and Hiroshima are repeated in every major Russian city. The Red Army, even if it made gains, would be bombed to shreds behind the front lines. Armed guerrilla groups in Germany, the Balkans, Iran, and Korea disrupt supply lines. As we saw in World War II, the real problems here are fighting the enemy on his own soil. Despite their grasp on Europe, the Germans gave it all up pretty quickly. France was liberated in a month. Romania instantly switched, despite 300,000 Germans defending it. Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria flipped almost instantly. Would the war really even reach this level? I'm not sure. There is the morality here to consider. I'm sure certain elements of the American military wouldn't care, but I don't know if Truman would really go all the way. We are talking about the man who didn't want to turn the Chinese-Korean border into a sea of radioactive cobalt. But hey, this scenario already relies on one historical figure acting out of character. Maybe if pushed to the extreme, Truman would have done it, relegating himself to being one of history's greatest monsters, being responsible for the death of tens of millions, obliterating Russia more than the Germans ever could. Or perhaps the Red Army leadership just gets angry at Beria immediately, marches on Moscow to spare their homeland from nuclear annihilation. Whether this ends in one city getting nuked, or dozens, it's not looking very good for Beria. The leadership complies with whatever Truman tells them to sign. So what might be the end result of this very quick, hot war? Well, I can imagine a mixed version of European republics with token monarchies, a completely pacified Soviet Union, one that might just fracture immediately. Eastern Europe would really be a mess. Could we see free elections? Perhaps. Could we see a mix of socialist and anti-communist factions fighting over the ruins? Perhaps that too. The last decade would really just be devastating for Russia, even more so than in our time. A 1-2 punch from the Germans and the Americans, an entire generation lost, probably two. And to the Russian people, these two enemies would be one and the same. During the Cold War, the USSR viewed the West as the continuation of fascism, and the Americans would have gone farther than the Germans ever did, finishing off cities that the Germans didn't even touch in the war. And here's the thing, the Soviets might not even fall. If the Soviets didn't fall, what happens once they actually get a nuke? Say Beria is killed, the Soviets sue for peace, and then they just bide their time. Does the concept of mutually assured destruction even exist when one side was completely devastated before they got the chance? If the Allies beat the Soviets by 1950, perhaps this is just another chapter in a far greater conflict. Maybe, just like after World War I, Europe is just as unstable, and the end result leads to the next great conflict. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.